Happy Halloween. So imagine, if you will, you're someone who's just suffered a lower body limb injury. For example, something's happened to your knee and you're walking with a limp. You get in touch with a physician, physical therapist. You go into their office. They prescribe some sort of treatment or some suggestions on how to use your limb in a way that's not going to exacerbate that injury. And then you leave, you go home, and over the course of the next several weeks, you try to implement those treatments. You try to walk on the limb normally, and then ideally, by the time the next visit happens, if there is a next visit, you'll be improving limb function. Unfortunately, as it stands, and as anybody who's walked with a limp knows, it's difficult to implement that kind of feedback yourself. And in the time between visits with a clinician, it's possible that the treatment could not be effective and you might be reinforcing that injury, or worst case scenario, you might actually be worsening it by using that limb incorrectly. What our team aspired to do here was to use an open source body area network to collect inertial data on the lower limbs, to be able to feed this into a machine learning algorithm, which can provide real-time patient feedback, allowing for real-time correction of gait and providing that data as well to clinicians. So changes in gait can occur due to aging, injury, or after surgery. Is a fairly common thing. Most people have experienced it at some point in their life. And in order to be able to monitor these changes, we have to be able to quantify gait somehow. Two major ways that that's currently done are through knee moment, which is basically the force at which you kick your knee forward during walking, and also in the vertical ground reaction force, or VGRF, which is essentially the vertical component of your step force whenever you push down, landing on that limb, or pushing off on the next step. So the way that these are typically quantified involve lab equipment like motion capture systems, or something like the split belt treadmill, where you're able to monitor the force on each limb independently. And while this works really well, it's obviously bulky and expensive, and you can't bring this into the real world. You can't walk around on a treadmill, obviously. So this prohibits the kind of real world monitoring that we're looking to do. And in particular, too, because we're looking at rehabilitating specific patients and providing personalized biofeedback, we want to be able to record this information on the patients acting as they normally would and using the limb as they would during their day-to-day activities. So another possible alternative to using a force plate treadmill to analyze gait is to use a network of inertial measurement sensors in order to quantify the relative motion of the limbs. And ideally, if you have these wirelessly connected at several locations on the body to form a body area network, you can get a full picture of the subject's motion as they're using the sensors. So IMUs utilize a set of three sensors: accelerometers, gyroscopes, and magnetometers, in order to track motion, linear and rotational on each of the three axes, and also the sensor's position within the Earth's magnetic field. This is an approach that's been tested previously and seems to correlate well based on earlier studies with using force plate analysis of gait. And there are commercial systems available to do this kind of monitoring of the body area network, such as this Delsis Trigno. However, because these sensors are commercial and closed source and relatively expensive, the set costs over $12,000, and I don't know about you, but I can't really afford that. It's sort of prohibitive to using these in a clinical setting or for widespread gait monitoring. In addition, because the hardware is closed source, we're not able to get specific data points out that we might be interested in. This does not provide, for example, access to the raw data. And in addition, if we need to add additional functionality, like say measuring some kind of analog input, we're not able to easily modify or user service these devices for our specific needs. So to get around this obstacle, we attempted to develop a novel open source alternative for inertial movement sensing. So to collect this data from multiple locations on the body, we designed a mesh network with 8 peripherals and 1 base station, up to 8 peripherals, which all stream data in response to requests from the central device. This base station is interfaced with a host computer that actually does the data processing and storage. And each of these peripherals is a self-contained 9-axis IMU sensor, which allows rapid collection of gait data from the user. So in order to allow for this self-contained operation, each peripheral is equipped with rechargeable batteries, subsystems for battery charge management and power management, an ESP32-based wireless microcontroller module, which functions both as the microcontroller running the system and the IMUs, and also as the access point for the mesh network. We chose to utilize the proprietary ESP Now wireless transmission protocol that uses the same IEEE regulations as wireless and Bluetooth, or Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. However, this has a much smaller code overhead, substantial benefits to range and power requirements, and was able to make the transfers in the time required to be able to do this real-time monitoring. So in essence, the controller is responding to queries from the base station, and then samples the IMU sensors, gets the data, and then transfers it back as a 44-byte packet. And then the host does this for each of the 8 sensors in the network, passes that to the host computer, and then the processing is done on that end. In order to allow for a modular approach, especially during the prototyping stage, we designed our initial variant of this stack of multiple boards. We have a main carrier board with the microcontroller unit, and then additional peripherals, including the power management system and the charge controller, are able to be added as needed in a modular fashion. This gave us some flexibility to try out different things like linear versus switch mode regulators to look at which one of those is going to allow us a good combination of noise and power saving during trials, and then change that as needed. And in addition, we can add battery charging internally or externally to save some weight. And also to deal with the chip shortage, which I'm sure you all are familiar with as well. One important aspect of being able to do this IMU monitoring is being able to restrain the IMU sensor inside of the enclosure where it's mounted on the body, because any spurious movement of the IMU is going to cause noise in your signal, obviously. So to minimize that error, we designed an enclosure that's specifically aimed at constraining the IMU portion of the device and keep it moving in complete accord with the enclosure itself on the body. So it's not able to shuffle around inside of this at all. We included a pair of strap mounts to allow for mounting using a Velcro band, i.e. across a limb, like on your leg. But we also put a section on the back that's designed to be a flat surface to allow for adhesive monitoring using a skin-safe gel. We wanted to test the system on real users, and so we mounted 8 of these peripherals on the various locations on the lower legs and torso. And in order to do a comparison with that Delta system to compare against a commercial standard, we co-mounted Delta's devices right next to each of the positions where our sensors were placed in order to do a side-by-side comparison. So in order to do this comparison, we ran a trial where subjects were asked to perform a basic walking activity on this split belt treadmill that I was mentioning earlier. They were asked to walk normally for 4 minutes in order to calculate their normal baseline vertical ground reaction force. And then for the following 2 sets of 4 minutes, they were asked to either overload or underload their limb performance. And you can think of that as just sort of either over-exaggerating a step or underloading your leg, in the case of over and underloading, respectively. Specifically, they were provided real-time biofeedback on a screen and asked to either overload or underload their VGRF by 5% in either direction. And we recorded the sensor response to both of those cases. This is to emulate, for example, during a limp, the favored leg is going to be overloaded and the disfavored leg is going to be underloaded. So we wanted to see, just as a basic test, can we tell the difference between these 2 conditions? We were able to determine from just looking at the raw output data that we're able to pretty clearly visibly distinguish between different locations on the body, which makes sense. Obviously, your torso is going to be moving differently than your legs during a walking motion. And we've established through this that our sensors are able to be sensitive enough to detect different positions on the body during walking. And when we look at overloaded versus underloaded conditions, we can see a couple of important things. First of all, individual step events can be pretty clearly discerned between themselves. So on top is our data, and on the bottom is commercial data taken from those COTS devices. We're able to see individual steps in each of these. In addition, there's a good time synchronization between these 2 signals. And also, when we just look at the overloaded versus underloaded conditions for the sensor, it's pretty obvious when the overloading is happening versus the underloading. So this is 2 of those trials superimposed from the same person, same sensor. Just one of them was 5% overload at VGRF, and the other one was 5% underload. So we see slightly less time resolution than the commercial option, but overall, we do see similar responses. And again, if it's enough to pull out the difference between over and underloading, then it should be sufficient to run our machine learning algorithm to provide that real-time biofeedback. So we wanted to try to feed an additional data stream that's not available in the commercial devices in order to supplement our machine learning algorithm and provide better biofeedback. We thought, what better way to do this than to measure the VGRF or a proxy for it directly? And so we looked at trying to measure heel drop force during walking. So we tried to put a simple commercial printed strain sensor underneath the heel, and we tried to integrate this as a peripheral device onto our peripheral device. So I mentioned earlier that one of the disadvantages of the COTS system is you can't add in additional modalities as needed. Our system, because it's open source, we can just add this new sensor into an analog input on our device and then provide that additional source of data. So this module is designed to be plugged into the peripheral that's mounted on or near the heel. It slips under the foot, and it does all of the required biasing and whatnot in a self-contained fashion and provides an analog output signal corresponding to the heel pressure. We were able to not only successfully detect heel presses using the circuit, but we can also tune it for specific heel pressure ranges in a predictable fashion. So we explored different levels of biasing voltage and different levels of feedback resistance to see what the trends were with the sensor output when we use, for example, heavier subjects, lighter subjects, if we're anticipating running, which is going to generate larger forces than walking and whatnot. And we were able to get a good ability to tune this device as needed. When we compare our system to the COTS devices that we tested, we have substantial benefits in terms of cost and also range. Interestingly enough, we can detect this up to over 160 meters away, which is useful if you're not trying to do monitoring right next to your host computer, as you would if you're, say, gardening or something like that. You can be running this inside your house and outside be recording data. We have similar sizes and weights at the moment. We're slightly bigger for now. The main drawback is we don't have quite the same temporal resolution. However, that's something that we're working on improving at this time, and currently we're at 50 hertz per peripheral in the entire system, and that speeds up if we use a smaller number of peripherals. Future work is obviously going to involve continued integration of that heel pressure sensor. We're looking at the ways that we can package this to best work with the foot and doing preamplification of that signal as well. And then obviously the second half of this project is development of that machine learning algorithm to provide that real-time biofeedback. And actually, I'm happy to report that as of last week, we had our first successful results with that prototype algorithm. And so we're actually looking at presenting on that soon, hopefully. We might actually need less than 8 peripherals to develop the best real-time biofeedback. So that's something we're going to be exploring as well. And then we're looking at improving the overall size and functionality of the device. You can see here a version 2 that's quite a bit smaller and much more in line with the commercial device. So getting away from that modularity and moving towards optimization. So I won't hold you all for lunch, but if you have any questions real quick, thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to do this now.